Hello and welcome. Kadon Enterprises is proud to present this video on how to play the game Ternion Factor. This product, as well as many other games and puzzles, can be found at www.gamepuzzles.com. Ternion Factor is a two-player strategy game where the goal of the game is to be the first player with all of their pawns on the board at the end of their turn. But what is a Ternion? A Ternion is a set or group of three. As you will see, many aspects of the game occur in threes. The rulebook describes the three strategy games and includes diagrams and strategy tips. It also includes two solitaire puzzles. This video will demonstrate how to play the two-player version of the primary game, Ternion Factor. To distinguish between the rules, strategy tips, and demonstration commentary, the rules will be displayed in yellow and the strategy tips will be displayed in blue. The Ternion board and equipment. The wooden board is laser etched with a geometric pattern and is divided into three sections by two colored lines. When playing with 4 players, the play area uses the entire board. For a 3-player game, all intersections on and inside the blue lines are used. For a 2-player game, all intersections on and inside the red line are used. There are 4 types of pieces used in playing Ternion Factor. Each player will own one set of 18 pawns in one of 4 colors. The move markers show the path a pawn traveled and the sequence of the 3 required turn actions. The Ternion markers identify the pawns used in creating Ternions during the player's turn. The Add Pawn markers identify new pawns added to the play area during the player's turn. These markers are removed from the board between turns and shared by all players. For this demonstration, I will enlarge the board so that only the 2-player area is visible. The Ternion markers and Add Pawn markers will be shown as a pair of stacks. To identify the current player, the player's color will be the background for the markers. In actual gameplay, the markers are held by the active player. Playing Ternion Factor. The player moving first is chosen. Any method may be used. Starting with the first player and proceeding clockwise, each player chooses their pawn color, then collects their 18 pawns. Any unused colors are returned to the storage bag. The starting player collects the markers. The placement phase. Starting with the first player, players take turns placing one pawn at a time in the play area. Placing pawns on boundary lines of the play area is permitted. During placement, all pawns are always separated by at least one unoccupied intersection. Placement ends when each player has 6 pawns in the play area. I will use the game shown here to demonstrate the rules and strategies of Ternion Factor. The placement of pawns and moves were optimized for this video and do not necessarily represent an effective way to play. The turn phase. A player's turn has 3 stages. 3 required turn actions, a review and adjustment stage, and finally passing the markers to the next player. Each turn action has 3 steps: moving a pawn and placing a move marker, checking for the creation of a Ternion, and resolving the Ternion if created. If a Ternion is not created, the resolution step is skipped. If all 3 turn actions cannot be completed, the player withdraws from the game. If only one player remains, that player is the winner. Turn action 1. Step 1. Moving a pawn. It is the blue player's turn. The player has decided to move this purple pawn. A player may move any pawn in the play area. Following the lines on the board, pawns may move one intersection. Once the pawn has completed its move, a move marker is placed to show the path and direction of travel. Move markers are always used sequentially. Step 2. Identifying the Ternion. If all of the following statements are true, a Ternion has been created and must be resolved. The pawn has stopped on an unoccupied intersection. The pawn moved belongs to the current player. There are 3 pawns on adjacent intersections, including the pawn that was moved. The 3 pawns do not have Add Pawn or Ternion markers on them. Since items 2 and 3 are false, a Ternion was not created. Step 3. Resolving the Ternion. This step is unnecessary, so it is skipped. Turn action 1 is now complete. The blue player's turn continues as there are still 2 turn actions remaining. Step 1. Moving a pawn. The player moves this pawn adjacent to 2 other pawns. The second move marker is placed on the path traveled. Step 2. Identifying the Ternion. Examining the 3 pawns, we see that all of the conditions to create a Ternion have been met. A Ternion marker is placed on top of each pawn in the Ternion. Pawns with an add pawn or Ternion marker on them cannot be moved or used to create other Ternions for the remainder of the player's turn. Notice that the Identify step occurs every time a pawn is moved. When a Ternion is created, it must be resolved immediately. Step 3. Resolving the Ternion. We begin by consulting the chart on page 10 in the rulebook. This chart tells you how many pawns you add or remove from the play area based on the Ternion just created. The player has 1 pawn in the Ternion and 2 players are represented, so 2 pawns are added to the play area. With a 2-player game, the chart can be simplified as shown here. I will use this version of the chart going forward. When adding pawns, place the Add Pawn marker on the pawn before placing the pawn in the play area. Any unoccupied intersection in the play area may be used. If you do not have enough pawns to complete the Add Pawn action, add as many pawns as you have left. Even if all of your pawns are in the play area, you still need to complete the turn in order to win. Turn action 2 is now complete. Turn action 3. Step 1. Moving a pawn. The player moves this pawn, then places move marker 3. Step 2. Identify the Ternion. Using the checklist, we determine that all of the conditions to create a Ternion have been met. Step 3. Resolving the Ternion. The Ternion markers are placed on the pawns in the Ternion. With 1 pawn in the Ternion, the chart says to add 2 pawns to the play area. Turn action 3 is now complete. The Review and Pass Marker Stages. The Review stage allows a player to modify some or all of their current turn. Pawns with Add Pawn markers can be moved to different locations. If pawns were removed, you can change which pawn in the Ternion was affected. Turn actions can be reversed in descending move marker order. The Pass Marker stage. All markers are removed from the board and passed to the next player, ending the current player's turn. Let's examine what happens when multiple Ternions are created. For their first turn action, the player moves a blue pawn, then places move marker 1. The checklist tells us that a Ternion was not created. For the second turn action, the player moves their own pawn here, then adds move marker 2. The checklist confirms that Ternions have been created. When multiple Ternions are created, one will take precedence over the others. The player will select the Ternion that contains the greatest number of their own pawns. If multiple Ternions meet the prior condition, the player may choose any one of those Ternions. Some Ternions require the removal of pawns. With 2 pawns in the Ternion, the chart says to remove 1 pawn, then add 2 pawns. Pawns are always removed before new pawns are added. Pawns are removed from the Ternion just created. A player may remove only their own pawns from the play area. The Ternion marker remains in place when the pawn is removed. An intersection with just a Ternion marker is still considered occupied for the rest of the player's turn. Pawns removed may be put back into play during any Add Pawn action, even during the current turn action. Turn action 3. The player moves this pawn and places move marker 3. The checklist determines that a Ternion has been created. The Ternion markers are placed on the pawns in the Ternion. Consulting the chart, we see that 2 pawns are to be added to the play area. When identifying a Ternion, remember to ignore pawns with markers on them. The 3 required turn actions are now complete. In the Review stage, the player does not make any changes. In the Pass Marker stage, all markers are removed and passed to the next player. Using the Jump move. A jump move requires 2 consecutive turn actions to complete. When jumping, a pawn may not jump over another pawn of the same color. The player wants to move this pawn to this location. Turn action 1. The pawn is moved to top the pawn to be jumped and move marker 1 is added. Since the intersection is occupied, a Ternion is not created. Turn action 2. The pawn moves to the destination intersection and move marker 2 is added. The checklist says that a Ternion has been created. We see, however, that 3 potential Ternions have been created by this move. Since all 3 Ternions have a single blue pawn, the player may choose which one will become the Ternion. Consulting the chart, we see that the player may add 2 pawns to the play area. For the third turn action, the player moves this blue pawn, then places move marker 3. The checklist tells us that a Ternion has been created. Ternion markers are added to the 3 pawns in the Ternion. With 2 blue pawns in the Ternion, 1 pawn is removed and 2 pawns are added. The player decides to remove this pawn, then adds 2 pawns to the play area, one of which is the pawn that was just removed. The turn action stage is now complete. In the review stage, the player does not make any changes. Finally, all markers are removed and passed to the next player. When is a jump move better than a slide move? The player sees an intersection that will add 2 pawns to the play area. Moving to that location will require 2 turn actions. During turn action 1, a Ternion is created. This takes the key pawn out of play. The player uses the undo feature to start over. Let's see how and why the jump move succeeds. Turn action 1 does not create a Ternion because the intersection is occupied. Turn action 2 completes the jump and creates 3 potential Ternions. All 3 have 1 purple pawn, so the player may choose any one of them. The chart says to add 2 pawns to the play area. Let's recap the rules. All play occurs on the lines and intersections on the board. Each player's turn has 3 stages: turn action stage, review and adjustment stage, pass marker stage. The turn action stage. Players need to complete 3 turn actions per turn or withdraw from the game. A turn action has 3 steps: moving a pawn, identifying the Ternion, and resolving the Ternion. Moving a pawn. Players may move any pawn in the play area. Pawns move 1 intersection at a time per turn action. A jump move requires 2 consecutive turn actions. After moving a pawn, place the next sequential move marker on the path traveled. Move markers show the move sequence and direction of the moving pawn. Identifying the Ternion. This step occurs every time a pawn is moved. A Ternion is created if the pawn stopped on an unoccupied intersection, belongs to the current player, is part of a group of 3 pawns on adjacent intersections, and none of the pawns have add pawn or Ternion markers on them. If multiple Ternions are created, the one with the greatest number of the current player's pawns is used. If multiple Ternions meet this criteria, the player may choose between those Ternions. Ternion markers are placed on the top of the pawns to identify the pawns in the Ternion. Resolving the Ternion. If the Identify step does not find a Ternion, this step is skipped. The chart on page 10 in the rulebook tells you how many pawns to add or remove. When removing pawns, remove pawns before adding new pawns to the play area. Pawns are removed from the Ternion just created. Only the current player's pawns are removed. The Ternion marker on the pawn removed remains on the intersection. When adding pawns to the play area, place the Add Pawn marker on the pawn first, then place the pawn on any unoccupied intersection. If insufficient pawns remain, add all remaining pawns, even if 0 pawns are added. The Review and Adjustment stage. The player may move any pawn with an Add Pawn marker to a new location, change which pawn was removed from a Ternion this turn, undo some or all of their move in descending move marker order. The Pass Marker stage. All markers are removed from the board and passed to the next player. This ends the current player's turn. Thank you for watching. For more information and to purchase this and other games and puzzles, please visit www.gamepuzzles.com.